Okay, good afternoon. My name is Evan Weiner. Been here before. Talking about 1936. We're going back a long time. There's something rather interesting for me about talking to you about this, because four people who were heavily involved in 1936, I either knew, my background's journalism, or interviewed them. Four people, which means I'm kind of old, right? I'm kind of old. I didn't know Jesse Owens, but Jesse Owens probably should have been the man of the year in 1936. Of course, there's Hitler. There was a presidential election between Franklin Roosevelt and Alf Landon. Roosevelt won. Spanish Civil War begins in 1936. Oh, there's a revolt that took place in 2023, the Hamas terrorist attacks. 1936, Arab revolt. Guess what? 87 years later, same issue. Absolute same issue. The second Italian-Ethiopian war ends. There is the Depression in the United States. It was also the year of the strike in 1936. And the King of England, Edward VIII, decides, I've had enough. I want to marry a commoner. Not necessarily a good guy, this guy, Edward VIII. The Electricity Act. Guess what? A lot of Americans in 1936 had no electricity, particularly the rural areas. The Electricity Act. The Hoover Dam was completed. That's my son about 25 years ago in front of the Hoover Dam. Joe DiMaggio made his New York Yankees debut. Any DiMaggio fans here? Nobody? Yes and no. If you met him, you wouldn't like him. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. Gone with the Wind, did you read that?
Yes.
So the movie?
Yes.
It came out in 1936, the book. The radio shows. The Jello show starring Jack Benny. Radio hits its stride in the mid-1930s, and Jack Benny, who was a stalwart of radio from 1932 to 1955, is one of the major players on radio. There's Kaiser Wilhelm. In 1936, Adolf Hitler would thumb his nose at the world, you know. Hey, I'm Adolf Hitler, stop me. And it's the year 1936 where Hitler should have been stopped, but wasn't. Here's Kaiser Wilhelm inspecting the troops during World War I. The First World War and its subsequent peace settlements gave rise to new ambitions, rivalries, and tensions. People had high expectations that the post-war peace settlement would create a new world order, which is a bad term if you hear some politicians talk about it, and ensure that the slaughter of the First World War was never repeated. These are the four guys who split up the world. The guy on the right is Woodrow Wilson. This is 1919. He is the American president. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Vittorio Orlando of Italy, George Clemenceau of France, and Woodrow Wilson would split up Europe, and in doing so would create Adolf Hitler. And I'll tell you how. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, created the League of Nations, an international body intended to promote peace and prevent war. The United States never joined the League of Nations. The treaty was an uneasy compromise as each of the victorious allies, the Brits, the Americans, the French, and Italy, well, you know, the war is over. We are pursuing other avenues of interest for us. Now, here's the problem with Germany. Germany was forced to surrender territory, disarm, and pay for the war's damages. These divisive conditions were criticized as overly vindictive by many in Britain and America. The treaty's term caused immediate outrage and lasting bitterness in Germany. But there is an irony in all of this. Because of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany came out stronger than it ever should have come out of it. The Treaty of Versailles left Germany in a surprisingly strong geostrategical position. Poland was created, so was Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states. The treaty put buffer states between Germany and one of its traditional rivals, Russia. How many of you have a background in Poland, or you came from? Oh, your people came from Poland. Czechoslovakia. I have Czechoslovakia, and the Baltic states, including Lithuania and Latvia. Anybody from Lithuania, Latvia, or families from there? You, okay. Fighting among the new states weakened them, and the geography of the new borders made them difficult to defend. Germany emerged from the war with small but relatively weak states on its eastern border. Now, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923. That officially ends World War I, although there was the Armistice Day on November 11, 1918. The senior statesmen stopped working personally on the treaty in June of 1919, and the Treaty of Lausanne in Switzerland was signed 1923 in July. France, Britain, Italy, Japan, Greece, Romania, and the new Republic of Turkey, now that the Ottoman Empire is gone. So why did Hitler hate Jews? Why did he hate them? Why did Hitler hate Jews? Well, take a look at this picture. This is either a man or a woman. Could be a woman, could be a man. Jewish star on the top. The stab in the back. Somebody stabbed the German army in the back. Who stabbed the German army in the back? You want to take a guess? Anyway, during the First World War, between 1914 and 1918, the Austrian Adolf Hitler was part of the German army. At the end of the war, he and many other German soldiers like him couldn't get over the defeat of the German Empire. The German army command spread a lie, the big lie. If you lie enough, it becomes the truth. That's what Joseph Goebbels said. This is the lie, the myth. The German army couldn't have lost the war on the battlefield, but somebody betrayed them. That's how they lost. They were too good on the battlefield, but somebody betrayed them. Well, it was called a stab in the back, and Hitler buys into the lie, buys into the myth. The Jews and the communists, because Trotsky, it was thought that Jews were behind communists because of Karl Marx, even though Karl Marx wasn't Jewish. The Jews and the communists had betrayed the country and brought a left-wing government to power that wanted to throw in the towel. And Hitler wrote about it. His struggle. What was his struggle? He was a painter. He was an obscure guy who happened to be in World War I fighting for the Germans, and he wasn't even a German. He was an Austrian. In his memoir and propaganda tract called Mein Kampf, My Struggle, Hitler predicted a general European war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Mein Kampf was written in jail after Hitler was arrested for his participation of the beer hall push in Munich, November 9th and 10th, 1923, when the Nazi Party tried to overthrow the German government. So Hitler's jailed, but they let him go in December 1924. First mistake, right? And there they are, a bunch of degenerates, a bunch of weird people who are all part of this thing now called the Nazi Party. By blaming the Jews for the defeat, Hitler created a stereotypical enemy. In the 1920s and 1930s, Germany was in a major economic crisis. So according to the Nazis, how do we solve this crisis? I know, let's kick out all the Jews. Let's get rid of all the Jews. That will be the solution to every problem we have in Germany. On February 25th, 1932, Hitler becomes a citizen of Germany. He was born in Austria, immigrated to Germany in 1913. He renounced his Austrian citizenship in 1925. The Nazis had a political message. They said, we are going to make Germany strong economically. And with that message, Hitler's party and the Nazis win the 1932 elections. But the guy who's sitting with Hitler is Paul von Hindenburg, and he is the president of Germany, but not for long. In 1933, on January 30th, von Hindenburg names Adolf Hitler the Führer, the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, as chairman of Germany. Hitler's plan is embraced by the Germans. They went along with him. Just following orders, right? Just following orders. And let's do away with politics. And we'll make Germany a powerful, united, one-party state. 1935, against the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler organizes the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And a few days later, he rearms Germany. Germany is in total violation of the Versailles Treaty, and guess what? Nobody cared. Nobody cared. They just let him go. And in 1936, there would be another world test, and the world would fail. This is Avery Brundage. He was the head of the United States Olympic Committee. And to his right is a guy by the name of Jeremiah Mahoney, Judge Jeremiah Mahoney. And I became familiar with him by going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. There is a little area in the Holocaust Museum, or was, non-Jewish help. The people who helped the Jews who were not Jewish during the time of the Holocaust and before that. Judge Mahoney sounded the alarms. Don't send the athletes to the 1936 Olympics. He called for a boycott in 1935. In 1931, the International Olympic Committee awarded the 1936 Summer Olympics to Berlin. Hitler was not involved in 1931. His Nazi party was coalescing at that point. The choice signaled Germany's return to the world community after its isolation in the aftermath of the defeat of 1918 in World War I. Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany and quickly turned the democracy into a one-party dictatorship that persecuted Jews, Romas, Jehovah's Witnesses, all political opponents, and others. The Nazis' claim of controlling all aspects of German life extended into sports. Now, think of what Hitler looked like, right? It wasn't much to look at, was it? Not really. The German sports imagery of the 1930s served to promote the myth of the Aryan, racial superiority and physical prowess. In sculpture and in other forms, German artists idealized athletes' well-developed muscle tone and heroic strength and accentuated Aryan facial features. Hitler was not blue-eyed, nor was he blonde, but that was what he wanted, blonde, blue-eyed German. This is Eric Seelig. He was a championship boxer from Germany. In April 1933, an Aryan-only policy was instituted throughout all of German athletic organizations. Non-Aryans, Jews, or individuals with Jewish parents, or Romas, Gypsies, were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations. The German Boxing Association expelled professional light heavyweight champion Eric Siegel in April 1933. Why? Because he was Jewish. Daniel Pren, one of the greatest tennis players of his time, is from Germany. He was removed from Germany's Davis Cup team. This woman I'm going to talk about now, Gretel Bergmann, I interviewed in 1993. Gretel Bergmann died at the age of 103 in 2017. When I interviewed her, she was about 79 years old, sharp as a tack. And I'll talk about Gretel Bergmann in a couple of minutes. Her name in America, Margaret Lambert. Margaret, that's what her name was in Germany. Her nickname was Gretel Lambert. She married a guy by the name of Bruno Lambert, who became a physician, and they fled to the United States in 1937. Anyway, she was exiled from her German club in 1933 and the German Olympic team in 1936. She trained in London, but she was forced back to Germany. This guy is a guy you never heard of. His name is Ernest Janke. He was once the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the United States. And he's getting reports, horrendous reports, what's going on in Germany. He was an American International Olympic Committee delegate, and he expressed outrage with the reports of what was happening within Hitler's Germany. And on November 25th, 1935, he sends a letter to the International Olympic Committee President, Count Henri Bellet-Latour. Lots of counts in the Olympics, lots of lords, lots of whatever. As I always said, out-of-work royalty, because I dealt with the IOC. And he floats the initial idea of an American boycott of the 1936 Berlin Summer Olympics. Don't send the boys, don't send the few girls over to Berlin. Don't legitimize Hitler. That's what Janke is saying. Well, this is 1935, and this board up here is talking about how horrible Jews are. Anti-Jewish sentiment, 1935. Well, the letter says this: neither Americans nor the representatives of other countries can take part in the games in Nazi Germany without at least acquiescing to the concept or contempt of the Nazis for fair play and their sordid exploitation of the games. The letter was never answered. Janke knew what was going on. He was warning people. Nobody cared. Janke was the former Assistant Secretary of the United States Navy, German descent, and he would be, in 1936, thrown out of the exclusive club known as the International Olympic Committee by July, and his spot was taken by a guy by the name of Avery Brundage, who was a racist, and he was anti-Semitic. Racist and anti-Semitic. Well, December 8th, 1935, and Jeremiah Mahoney has a news conference. He is the guy who's selecting the athletes for the American team, and this is what he says on December 8th, 1935. There's no room for discrimination on grounds of race, color, or creed in the Olympics. The AAU voted in 1933 to accept an invitation to compete at Berlin in 1936, provided Germany pledged that there would be no discrimination against Jewish athletes. If that pledge is not kept, I personally do not see why we should compete. Mahoney. With that, Mahoney gets a spot in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. That's what the quote is on his plaque. There was a guy by the name of Ben Johnson. Ben Johnson was part of the United States Olympic team. And you're talking about Jim Crow America in 1936. And he gets upset with Mahoney, and this is his reasoning. Mahoney was the guy who was picking the team. And Johnson says the Negro in the South is discriminated against as much as the Jews in Germany. It's futile and hypocritical that Judge Mahoney should attempt to clean up conditions in Germany before cleaning up similar conditions in America. Hitler admired some of America's policies, like Jim Crow, like wiping out the Native American. And he said Henry Ford was one of his heroes because of what America had done in the 19th century and also the 20th century with Jim Crow. Well, here's Franklin Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt decides there's no need for a boycott. Athletes should be athletes. I knew Marty Glickman. How many here remember Marty Glickman? I worked with Marty Glickman, 1988. Marty Glickman was one of two kids from New York City selected to the 1936 American team. He was the fastest kid in Brooklyn. That was his autobiography, fastest kid in Brooklyn. He was a brash 18-year-old in 1936. And when I worked with him, that would be, 52 years later, he was 70 years old. He was a brash 70-year-old in 1988, but I worked with him. And if you would ask him about what was going on with Berlin and Roosevelt, he was okay with going to the Olympics. He and Sam Stoller, who were supposed to run together in the 4x400 relay in Berlin. I knew Sam ran the Milrose Games. Marty, you'd say hello to him, and he would say, may that Avery Brundage rot in hell. Sam, on the other hand, didn't say very much. Didn't say very much at all. Two prominent Jews never competed in the 1936 Olympics. But he agreed with Roosevelt, because he and Sam, they were going to win that gold medal in the 4x100 relay. They were going to win it. And then they were going to go to the podium, the medal around their necks, stick it right into the Fuhrer's face. It never happened. Roosevelt said go. Marty agreed with him. For the first time in the history of the modern Olympic Games, people in the United States and Europe called for a boycott of the Olympics because of what would later become known as human rights abuses. Well, Brundage, he had assurances from Hitler. All's good, not a problem. This is what he said. Certain Jews must understand that they cannot use these games as a weapon in their boycott against the Nazis. Brundage labeled the anti-Olympic campaign a Jewish communist conspiracy. Some American newspapers called Brundage a Nazi stooge. That's probably the nicest thing you could say about him. He was far worse than a Nazi stooge. But anyway, that was Brundage. Well, this is when Brundage got to Berlin. He must have felt at home because this is what he saw. All kind of swastikas next to the 5 Olympic rings. In August, the Nazi regime tried to camouflage its violent racist policies while it hosted the Summer Olympics. Most anti-Jewish signs were temporarily removed, and newspapers toned down their harsh rhetoric. About 12, 13 years ago, I was giving a talk at Stanford JCC, and there was a guy about 90 years old there at the time. And he was telling me about his family exiled him out of Germany as a 13-year-old in 1933. His father was a newspaper guy, and I didn't ask what happened to his family. He said in 1936 he went to visit his family that relocated in Prague. And he said going through Germany, going through Berlin wasn't a problem because they were going to host the Olympics. But coming home after the Olympics, it was you dirty Jew, and he got spat upon, he got kicked, and all going back to London. He ended up going to Columbia University. He came over to the United States around 1938, 1939. So an illusion. The Berlin Games presented to foreign spectators and journalists with a false image of a peaceful, tolerant Germany. Or as Mel Brooks would have said, Hitler. The Hitler with a song in his heart. Wasn't that at all. But Germany had the propaganda coup. They won. 49 nations sent teams to the games. It legitimized the Hitler regime. And there was no stopping afterwards. Whatever he wanted, he got. He took. And people stood. They stood with their hands in their pockets and didn't do a thing. Well, in the eyes of the world, Hitler wins. But more importantly, at home in Germany, Hitler is legitimized by those countries that came over and participated in the Olympics. There was one other thing that was going on to make Hitler more popular. Television. 1935, Hitler and the Germans came up with television. Commercial television. Before England, before the United States. The first regular electronic television service in Germany began in Berlin on March 22nd, 1935. I'll go through the technical stuff. It used a 100-line system. It was on the air for 90 minutes, 3 times a week. The Nazis used the 1936 Olympic Games for propaganda purposes. The Nazis promoted an image of a new and strong and united Germany while masking the regime's targeting of Jews and Romans and Gypsies, as well as Germany's growing militarism, something that they were not supposed to be doing, and nobody stopped them. Jesse Owens actually did stop them for a little bit. Jesse took Marty's place in one of the races. It's during the 1936 Summer Olympics that Germany used TV up to 8 hours a day, and you could see it in Berlin, you could see it in Hamburg. Let's use television as a medium for propaganda. But the television set sales never materialized. and it only reached a small number of viewers, and the Germans gave up on TV. And there's Marty Glickman, and there's Sam Stoller, and I knew both of them. Like I said, Marty was the guy who would talk. Sam wouldn't. Marty was, how many of you are from Brooklyn? In Brooklyn, you're supposed to talk, right? Right? In Brooklyn. There's something in the water in Brooklyn that makes you talk, right? Right? Them bums, right? Use, toity. Anyway, Marty, the day before the 4x100 meter relay, they were replaced by Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf, the team's two fastest sprinters. The coaches, Dean Cromwell, the coach, claimed they needed their fastest runner to win the race. That wasn't true. It's a relay. It's a relay. You got to know how to hand off and take the baton and run. And Jesse Owens did not know how to do that. So it was kind of sabotage in a way. Well, here's Hitler talking to one of the athletes. Glickman said that the coach, Dean Cromwell, and Avery Brundage were motivated by anti-Semitism and the desire to spare the Fuhrer of the embarrassment of two American Jews from New York on the winning podium. Sam didn't believe that anti-Semitism was involved. He was very naive, but he was 21 years old, and he described the incident in his diary as the most humiliating episode in his life. We were shocked. This is Marty. We were shocked. Sam was completely stunned. He didn't say a word at the meeting or in the meeting. He didn't say much 50 years later when I knew him. I was a brash 18-year-old kid, and I said, "Coach, you can't hide the world-class sprinters." At which point Jesse spoke up and said, "Coach, I've won my 3 gold medals, the 100, 200, and the long jump. I'm tired. I've had it." This is Jim Crow America, even in Germany. Jim Crow America. So he's on the team, along with Ralph Metcalf, Draper, and Wyckoff stayed. "Let Marty and Sam run. They deserve it," said Jesse. And Cromwell pointed his finger at him and said, "You do as you're told." Those days, black athletes did as they were told. And Jesse was quiet after that. After all, it is Jim Crow America. Okay, this is Gretel Bergman. Margaret Lambert. I interviewed her in 1993, New York Athletic Club. And I don't know if you know the history of the New York Athletic Club, but it was one of those no Jews, no dogs allowed places for a long time. And we got in there. It was me, a guy named Mark Schneider, and we were waiting to interview her. And for whatever reason, you're at a news conference, you have to wait for the guy or the woman to tell you, "Go, you can talk." This was the American Olympic Committee. It was some sort of gala affair. And so we're standing around, and we're just chatting with one another before we were officially allowed to talk. And I looked at Margaret Lambert, and I said, "You know, 25 years ago, you couldn't stand here, Marv couldn't stand here, I couldn't stand here." And she laughed, "Better here than Berlin." Well, she was the athlete. She was Europe's best athlete, track and field. She did the long jump. She did a lot, set a lot of records. And she is going along with the plan. Going along, although subconsciously she knew she was never going to compete for Germany. So finally we get to go ahead. We could ask questions. Let me ask you. You have a chance speaking Gretel Bergman, knowing what I just told you. What would you ask? What would you ask? Why? They let me always ask the first question. And this first question was a one-word question. Why? Her answer? Because I had to give my people hope. You don't understand what was going on in Germany in 1933 and 1934 and 1935. They took our homes away. They took our jobs away. They took everything away from us. They made us wear stars, yellow stars. And here I was, I knew I was never ever going to be in the Olympics, but I had to give my people a ray of hope. Just a little hope, just a little, although I knew I was never going to compete. She left Germany with Dr. Bruno Lambert, her boyfriend, who is also an athlete. He became a doctor in 1937. Ended up in Ellis Island with $10 in their pockets, $20 between them. They ended up in Forest Hills. He became a doctor. She had all kind of little jobs. And Germany was in the rearview mirror. She was never, ever going to go back. She did, though. 2 weeks before the Olympics began, Gretel Bergmann, German officials informed the Jewish athlete Gretel Bergmann that she was denied a place on the team, although she had equaled the German women's record in the high jump. The Germans sacrificed the chance for a gold medal with this action, but they didn't want her around. Yet, they did have one Jewish fencer, one Jewish athlete by the name of Helene Meyer. Now, her father was Jewish. German authorities allowed the star fencer, Helene Meyer, to represent Germany at the Olympics in Berlin, but she was viewed as a non-Aryan because her father was Jewish. She did win the silver medal in the individual fencing. She saluted Hitler, Heil Hitler, on the podium. No other Jewish athlete competed for Germany in the Summer Games. Her story is kind of interesting. We don't know much about her story. She fled to California. That's where she ended up. She died very young at the age of 42, left virtually no correspondence, never gave any interviews, but she ended up in California. He steals the show. Adolf Hitler had hoped that the 1936 Berlin Games would prove his theory of Aryan racial superiority. Owens would win 4 gold medals in the 100, the 200 meter, the 400 meter relay, and the long jump. He set 3 world records. One of those world records was in the 4x100 meter relay. He took Marty Glickman's place. He did not know how to take the baton and give the baton away during the race. They had to teach it to him right before the race. Could have been a case of sabotage, maybe, by the American team. Jesse overcame that. Marty and Sam and Gretel Bergmann never got a chance to compete in the Olympics. 9 athletes who were Jewish or of Jewish parentage won gold medals or won medals in the Nazi Olympics, including Meyer and 5 Hungarians. 7 Jewish male athletes from the United States went to Berlin. Like many of the European Jewish competitors at the Olympics, many of these young men were pressured by Jewish organizations to boycott the Games. Marty said it wasn't going to happen. He was going to win that gold medal and stick it right into the Fuhrer's face. This guy is a guy by the name of Wolfgang Furtzner, and he ran the Olympic Village. The Olympics are over. 3 days later, he kills himself. He was the vice commander of the Olympic Village. He commits suicide with a pistol shot on August 19th, 3 days after the Games. Why? He was afraid the authorities would find out he had Jewish blood. So he killed himself. Jesse Owens got a ticker tape parade down Broadway. Never went to the White House, but got a ticker tape parade down Broadway. It was September 3rd. Roosevelt did not receive or contact Owens. Owens said, Hitler didn't snub me. It was our president who snubbed me. The president didn't even send me a telegram. Owens defeated racism on the world stage, but couldn't escape it at home. And why didn't Roosevelt contact Owens? He's running for president again. And it would not be a good look in front of Southern Democrats if he had Jesse Owens at the White House in the age of Jim Crow. Alf Landon was running for president, the Republican nominee. This is a campaign poster from 1936. Roosevelt introduced the second New Deal in 1935. And you should be happy he did, because how many of you are on Social Security? Washington reporters, you got all these people, these politicians, talking about we got to cut Social Security. Washington journalists, of whom I have very little respect for, and I'm a journalist, Washington politicians should reread the 1935 Social Security Act, all they have to do is read 2 sentences. Employees pay, workers pay. Pay into the Social Security system. That's what you do. Why don't you ask that question to the people who want to cut Social Security? Hey, that might require an iota of research. Can't do that. Anyway, the Democratic Congress also passed a major tax revision labeled by its opponents as the Soak the Rich tax that raised tax rates for persons with large incomes and for large corporations. Roosevelt would be in that large income, well, not large incomes. He had a lot of money. He wasn't making all that much money as President of the United States, but he was a traitor to his class, Franklin Roosevelt. The Democratic Convention, North Carolina's 26 votes for Roosevelt. Roosevelt had widespread popularity. His policies had evoked stiff criticism. People like Huey Long, who was shot and killed in 1935. He planned to run against Roosevelt as a Democrat, including former supporters. Huey Long was once a supporter. There he is, Time magazine, the cover. He was a senator from Louisiana. He supported the president. He became dissatisfied with Roosevelt's policies. He had something called share the wealth, every man a king. And that was tempting to a depression-shocked public. A private poll in the spring of 1935 indicated that Long could unite the various nationwide radical movements, and he could get up to 4 million votes in 1936, and he could have impacted the balance of power between the 2 major parties, representing a threat to Roosevelt's re-election. He was assassinated on September 9th, 1935. Well, it's the U.S. presidential election, and there's Alf Landon. The Republicans held their national convention in Cleveland, Ohio, between June 9th and 12th, and they chose the Kansas governor, Alf Landon, who was a moderate progressive. The delegates unanimously ratified Landon's choice of a running mate, Frank Knox, the publisher of the Chicago Daily News and a critic of the New Deal. But here's Roosevelt, a gallant leader. The legislation FDR had already shepherded to fruition, such as Social Security. Oh yes, unemployment benefits. You know who you got to thank for that? Franklin Roosevelt. Had proven to be highly popular among many Americans, except the opposition party and people who ran newspapers and the gilded people. They didn't want it. Landon's political moderate accepted much of the New Deal's agenda, but he criticized it as wasteful and inefficient. Later in the campaign, Landon also accused Roosevelt of corruption, by which he meant he allegedly amassed so much power that he was subverting to the Constitution. But Roosevelt would win. In one of these scientific polls back in 1936, the forecast was Roosevelt would get 54% of the vote and 315 electoral votes. He would win the second term on November 3rd. The election took place as the Depression entered its 8th year. Roosevelt seeking to propel his New Deal economic policies through Congress. Well, the polls were off. Roosevelt actually got almost 61% of the vote, Landon 36%. Roosevelt carried 46 of the 48 states, lost Maine and Vermont. He lost 8 votes. He got 523 electoral votes, 98.49% of the electoral vote, and that is the highest percentage of anybody got of any candidate since 1820. Spanish Civil War is taking place. It starts. Francisco Franco. And Roosevelt keeps out of this. Why? This is his political calculus. On July 18th, troops under the leadership of General Francisco Franco began an uprising against the democratically elected government of Spain. The revolt quickly escalated into a civil war. Republicans in Spain, actually the Republicans in the United States, supported the overthrow of the Democratic Republic, and they sent some support. But the Soviet Union sent money and munitions along with Mexico. Volunteers nicknamed the International Brigaders came from countries including Ireland, France, Poland, Canada, and the United States. And there is Franco. The coup was engineered by Franco and other generals in mid-July, launched a self-described crusade to save Spain from, Jewish Messianic Bolshevik forces and social chaos. One should always be aware, though, of those who impose salvation on any society. Behind the general stood elements of the old ruling classes, landlords, businessmen, Catholic clergy, who were threatened by the growth of socialistic sentiments in significant segments of Spain's toiling population, separatism in Catalonia, which is Barcelona, and the Basque region, and the more traditional liberal aim of anti-clericism. Catholics are important here. They voted for Roosevelt, and Roosevelt is not going to come out and support anybody in Spain because he's worried about losing the Catholic vote. A poster of the Spanish Civil War. Avowed fascist groups like the Falange and the Johns rallied to the side of the rebel officers, Franco. Meanwhile, same time, same place, except it's 2023, the Arab Revolt. The Arab Revolt was caused by the Arab desire for independence and concern over the idea of a Jewish national home. Jewish national home, 1917, Balfour Doctrine. Let's have a two-state solution. The revolt began with spontaneous acts of violence committed by the religiously and nationalistically motivated followers of the Sheikh Az el-Din el-Qassam, who was killed by the British in 1935. In April, the murder of 2 Jews led to escalating violence, and the Khamasmat group initiated a general strike in Haifa and Nablus. At that point, the Arab political parties formed the Arab Higher Committee presided over the Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Hassouni. The Mufti was friends with who? Adolf Hitler. He was an ally of Hitler. And here is the Arab Revolt. It called for a general strike, non-payment of taxes to Britain, the closing of municipal governments, although government employees were allowed to stay at work, demanded an end to Jewish immigration. Demanded an end to Jewish immigration, a ban on land sales to Jews, and national independence. Can't sell to Jews. It's like Bronxville. Simultaneously, with the strike, Arab rebels joined by volunteers from neighboring Arab countries took to the hills, attacking Jewish settlements and British installations in the northern part of the country. Nothing's changed, has it? No. It's 87 years later, and there's the Arab Revolt. By the end of the year, the movement had assumed the dimensions of a national revolt, with the mainstay being the Arab peasantry. The Second Italian Ethiopian War starts in 1936. That's Haile Selassie. And it starts on October 3rd. 200,000 soldiers of the Italian army attacked from Etruria, an Italian colony possession without the declaration of war. The Ethiopian counteroffensive managed to stop the Italian advance for a few weeks. The war would continue. Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, was named Time magazine's Man of the Year for standing up to Italian Prime Minister Benito Mussolini. On March 31st, the Italians defeated an Ethiopian counteroffensive by the main Ethiopian army commanded by Selassie. On November 18th, the Italian Empire was recognized by the Emperor of Japan in Italy, recognized the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. Selassie would go into exile. Now the Depression lingers, all these men waiting for free soup and bread. There was a flicker of hope in 1936, the National Labor Relations Act. The 1935 law guaranteed the workers the right to organize and join labor unions and to engage in collective bargaining and strikes. Also set up the National Labor Relations Board, a federal agency designed to enforce labor law. Well, the Depression lingers, and this is what is called a sit-in strike. And it is done by members of the United Auto Workers Union. Workers wanted money. They didn't want to see the Gilded Age people, the fat cats, keep all the money. They wanted some of the money to trickle down to them. The United Auto Workers recently formed a trade union, and they had slowly and secretly begun organizing at General Motors. Organizers decided to focus on the Fisher Body Plant number 1, Flint, Michigan, home to 7,000 workers, and the place where car bodies were made. Remember a joke when I was a kid about, this is a sexist joke, but we were boys, right? And it would be, body by Fisher, mind by Mattel. That's what we said about you. And I apologize to anybody I offended then and I offended now, but hey, we're a bunch of 12-year-olds at that time. Anyway, organizers met with Flint workers at their houses and talked them out of walking off the job right away. Instead, organizers planned to stop production through a sit-down strike in January of 1937. After the Christmas bonuses were paid. We got our bonuses, we're going on strike. The plan was derailed on December 30th when workers at the body plant saw critical equipment being lugged onto railroad cars to be sent to other factories. Word was out that the Flint factory was a Union stronghold. Workers gathered for an emergency meeting, then flocked back to the plant. The strike was on. And this was the strike. These are pieces of cars. We're not leaving. We're not leaving. We're staying. General Motors had been taken by surprise, though it had suspected the workers might strike. They wasn't aware that they would use a new tactic of sitting down or occupying the plant. And that starts on December 30th. 1936, year of the strike, has to be New York. Look, it's the Automat. Horn and Hardard. How many of you went to the Automat? Do you miss it?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, there is an Automat in, where is it, down in St. Martin's. Petersburg, St. Martin's. There's an Automat. Sensing an atmosphere friendlier to labor activities, unions went on strike, surpassing what had been done during the Roosevelt administration's first few years. Over 2,100 strikes occurred, 8% more than in 1935, 17% more than 1934. Two-thirds of the action took place in New York, Pennsylvania, California, and Ohio. Most of the work stoppages happened in the textile industries. My grandfather had a pants factory then, followed by construction and transportation and communication. Just after Roosevelt's victory, the country witnessed another round of labor militancy. Sit-down strikes rocked the auto industry, starting with General Motors. But the Depression continued, the unemployment rate about 17%. Not good to be the king. Nope, nope, nope. If you're Edward VIII, not good to be the king. On December 11th, King Edward VIII spoke to citizens in England and its territory and announced that he had abdicated the throne in favor of his brother George VI, so he could be free to marry the woman he loved, Mrs. Wallace Simpson, who's in the midst of getting a divorce. Edward had made the first royal broadcast, so he knew the power to reach people by using radio in their homes. What Edward did eventually broadcast, George VI was the new king, and Edward was going into exile. And there is George VI. It looks like Elizabeth, doesn't it? Edward VIII's attempts to gain the royal family's acceptance of Simpson, who obtained a preliminary decree of divorce on October 27th, met with firm opposition backed by the Church of England, most politicians in Britain, and in the Commonwealth. I found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king, as I wished to do, without the help and support of the woman I love. On that night, he left for Austria, apart from Simpson. Like Chersey gets to the farms and rural areas, The Rural Electrification Act, signed into law during May. The law provided low-cost loans to rural farmers to help them create cooperative electric power companies. The cooperatives would bring them electricity into their homes in the rural regions of the United States. While electricity was quite common in U.S. cities during this time, much of rural America did not have access to electricity or to indoor plumbing. That is the Hoover Dam that opens in 1936. It's a concrete arched gravity dam in the Black Canyon of the Colorado River on the border between Nevada and Arizona. It was constructed between 1931 and 36 during the Great Depression, dedicated by Roosevelt September 30th, 1935. Joe DiMaggio, Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper, becomes a New York Yankee in 1936. He joined the Yankees. He was traded to the Yankees on November 21st, 1934. Yankees traded 4 players, sent money to the San Francisco Seals, DiMaggio's hometown team, in exchange for DiMaggio's rights. On May 3rd, he made his debut against the St. Louis Browns. How many of you remember the St. Louis Browns? And now the Baltimore Orioles. They left St. Louis after the 1953 season. He had 3 hits. He was 3 for 6 that day. Gone with the Wind. Yeah, you've read that, Margaret Mitchell. In June, Margaret Mitchell's novel, Gone with the Wind, is released. The book focused on the life of the fictional Southern belle, Scarlett O'Hara, in Atlanta prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, during the war, and during Reconstruction. The book became one of the best-selling novels in history. Radio stars, Major Bowes, The Amateur Hour. How many of you remember Major Bowes? Oh yeah. He had the #1 show in America. He had 45.2% of the listening audience, the 100%, tune in on Sundays at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. He was on NBC. Rudy Valley. It is hard to believe Rudy Valley was as big as Elvis, big as Frank Sinatra, big as the Beatles at one point in his career. And people ask, who? Now, Rudy Valley. The Fleischmann's Yeast Hour. Is Fleischmann still around? Fleischmann's Yeast Hour, NBC Red. He got 28.2% of the people listening on Thursday night at 8 o'clock. The #3 show, the Jell-O program with Jack Benny. Well, it was on NBC Blue. The Jell-O gelatin was the sponsor, and it got a 26.8% rating Sunday nights at 7 p.m. When you look at all these people, Major Bowes didn't last all the Amateur Hour did. Rudy Valley didn't last, but Jack Benny would last 23 years on radio and until his death in 1974. He had a great career of 42 years. The legacy, that's Gerald Ford. He finally brings Jesse Owens to the White House. And this picture, courtesy of the U.S. Holocaust Museum. U.S. Holocaust Museum. After the '36 Olympics, Jesse Owens accepted the job as a playground instructor for underprivileged youth in Cleveland. He got $30 a week. He became a band leader, owner of a basketball team, part-time owner in the dry cleaning business. In 1940, with the money he runs or earns in an exhibition race against a horse, he had to run against a horse. He ran against a horse. They paid the money to race a horse. He returns to Ohio State University to resume his studies. 1949, the Owens family moves to Chicago, where he launched a public relations company. He travels extensively, speaking on athletic competition and its ability to inspire race relations. 1976, President Gerald Ford presents Jesse Owens with the Medal of Freedom, the highest honor that the U.S. bestows upon a civilian. The legacy of the Jewish athletes, Roman Cantor from that Olympics. Many Jewish athletes who competed in the Olympics prior to 1936 or the 1936 Olympics would die in concentration camps during the Holocaust. Among them, Ilja Zapman, a Polish swimmer, Roman Cantor, a Polish fencer. Both competed in 1936 and would die in Majdanek. Helene Meyer died young. She was 42, and did not leave much correspondence. There are no films of her talking about the time. She never wrote a book. She fled to California in 1940. 2000, when Sports Illustrated was a legitimate magazine, they named Meyer the greatest fencer of the 20th century. Berlin, Germany may bid for the 2036 Olympics. Good idea or not, the 100th anniversary of the Hitler Olympics? What do you think? Lousy idea. The legacy. Germany invaded Poland, September 1st, 1939. That started World War II. The United States entered the war on December 8th, 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The war ended in 1945. Spain. The Nationalists won the Spanish Civil War in 1939. Francisco Franco hung on to power until his death in 1975. Franco rescued many Jews, believe it or not. How'd he do it? Got on a boat from, say, Amsterdam, go through Spain, go. We'll see you later. That's how he did it. Somewhere between 30 and 60,000 Jews were saved. Most people think it was about 45,000. Franco did not recognize Israel's statehood, maintained strong relations with the Arab world, but on September 16, 1968, the Spanish government formally revoked the 1492 Edict of Expulsion, the Inquisition, against Spain's Jewish population. Go figure. Middle East, any different? 1937, in July, a British commission reported that the Arab revolt was caused by the Arab desire for independence and concern over the idea of a Jewish national home. The committee advised the partition of Palestine. Additionally, it recommended the compulsory transfer of Arab Palestinians from the territories earmarked for the Jewish state. The Arabs rejected the proposal. The revolt was stepped up in 1937. 1938, Israel became a country in 1948. The problems in the Middle East continue. That is a breadline in New York City. The Great Depression lasted between 1929 and 1941. It was the longest and deepest downturn in the history of the United States and the modern industrial economy. The UAW is one of the most powerful unions in America. The 1936 legacy, King Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor lived in Paris and on the French Riviera with Wallace Simpson after his abdication. Edward and Wallace met with Adolf Hitler in 1937. He became convinced that Great Britain could not defeat Germany in a war. Haile Selassie would return to Ethiopia in 1941. He was overthrown in 1974. The 1936 legacy, well, you're getting some power now. The Rural Electrification Act, 90% of farms lacked power in 1936 because of the cost of getting electricity in rural areas. By 1950, 80% of U.S. farms had electricity. Boulder Dam was renamed Hoover Dam in 1947. Joe DiMaggio. 13 seasons, Joe DiMaggio's teams won 10 American League pennants and 9 World Series. He was voted in 1969 the game's greatest living player. Yankee Clipper, cultural icon in the 20th century. Gone with the Wind. Margaret Mitchell's book becomes a movie. It's released in 1939. In 2020, Warner Media removed Gone with the Wind from its streaming platform, HBO Max, for 2 weeks. HBO Max said the 1939 film was a product of its time and depicted ethnic and racial prejudices that were wrong then and are wrong today. When the movie returned to the platform, the disclaimer video introduction discussed the movie's history and was put into context of 1939 or 1940 entertainment. How many of you watched the radio? You watched the radio. What'd you see?
Helen Trent. Our imagination.
That's it, theater of the imagination. Radio was enjoying its golden days, but television was developing. By 1955, the golden age of radio was over. Old-time radio shows, you want to listen to them? They're available on computers and phones. Just look them up. Today, radio stations have little value and AM stations are disappearing. Well, thank you so much. Any questions, any comments? Your turn to talk.